Two brothers disappeared in Stanley Park. In 1947, 75 years later, they were discovered under leaves. A mystery frozen in time suddenly thawed after decades of silence. The forest kept its secret until nature itself decided to reveal what had been hidden beneath the decomposing foliage. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. On a biting January morning in 2022, Mary Johnson pulled her woolen scarf tighter around her neck as she ventured through the misty trails of Seattle's Discovery Park. At 71, the widow found solace in these solitary walks, her camera hanging faithfully around her neck. Photography had become her companion in the years since her husband's passing, a way to capture beauty in a world that sometimes felt too empty. The park breathed around her, ancient cedars swaying gently, their branches heavy with morning dew. Mary inhaled deeply, savoring the rich scent of wet earth and decaying leaves that perfumed the winter air. Few others braved the park this early, especially on such a cold morning, which suited her perfectly. The solitude was a comfort, a space where memories couldn't find her so easily. As she followed a less traveled path, her attention caught on a patch of disturbed ground near the base of a massive cedar. Something glinted dully in the weak morning light, something that didn't belong among the natural debris of the forest floor. Mary paused, her photographer's eye drawn to the incongruity. "How strange," she murmured, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air as she carefully knelt down, her joints protesting the movement. Pushing aside a tangle of exposed roots and sodden leaves, her gloved fingers brushed against something metallic. The elderly woman gently extracted the object, brushing away decades of accumulated soil. In her palm lay a child's button, rusted and tarnished, still clinging stubbornly to a scrap of faded fabric. The pattern was barely discernible. What might have once been a cheerful design now merely ghostly impressions on corroded metal. A peculiar heaviness settled over Mary, a sensation that transcended the physical weight of the tiny object. The forest seemed to grow quieter, as if holding its breath. The mist thickened around her, and the old trees stood sentinel, guardians of secrets long buried beneath their roots. Something about the button stirred fragments of memory, whispered conversations from her childhood, her mother's worried face, newspaper headlines that had frightened her as a young girl. The elderly photographer slipped the button into her coat pocket, unable to leave it behind, though unsure why it affected her so deeply. Mary couldn't possibly know that this small, insignificant object would soon reopen one of Washington's most heartbreaking cold cases, the mysterious disappearance of two young brothers who had vanished without a trace 75 years ago, their fate a question that had haunted the region for generations. Unable to shake the feeling that she'd stumbled upon more than just garbage, Mary Johnson clutched the rusted button in her palm as she made her way home. The small metal disc seemed to pulse with untold stories, weighing far more than its physical presence should allow. After a restless night, she reached for her smartphone and dialed a number she'd saved years ago but never used. "Robert Smith, this is Mary Johnson. I found something in Discovery Park yesterday that might interest you." The local historian arrived at her modest home within the hour, his eyes widening behind wire-rimmed glasses as Mary placed the button and fabric scrap on her kitchen table. Robert's reputation for obsessing over Seattle's unsolved mysteries was well earned. His fingers trembled slightly as he examined the artifact. "This pattern," he whispered, "it matches descriptions from the case files, the fabric weave, the distinctive star design." He looked up at Mary, excitement and dread mingling in his expression. This could be connected to the brothers' case. By afternoon, Robert had contacted the Seattle Police Department. Detective Sarah Brown arrived with a forensics team, carefully documenting the discovery site while officers cordoned off a section of the park with yellow tape. The elderly photographer watched from a distance, arms wrapped around herself against more than just the January chill. Word spread through the city like wildfire. Local news vans parked along the street, reporters clutching microphones in gloved hands. The Boys in the Woods case, a 75-year-old mystery that had haunted generations of Seattle residents, was suddenly front-page news again. Two young brothers vanished without a trace in 1947, explained a television reporter, her breath visible in the cold air. Their disappearance became one of Washington's most enduring mysteries. For Mary, the media frenzy felt distant compared to the storm brewing inside her. As she watched the commotion from her living room window, fragments of childhood memories surfaced, hushed conversations between adults that stopped when she entered rooms, her mother's strange reaction whenever the park was mentioned, a photograph hastily hidden away. The button had unearthed more than just a cold case. It had disturbed something personal, something Mary had buried deep within herself decades ago, a secret she'd carried without fully understanding its weight. That night, as snow began to fall over Seattle, the widow sat alone with a faded family album open on her lap, searching for clues in the faces of relatives long gone, wondering which of them had known the truth about the boys in the woods, and why that truth had remained buried for so long. Mary Johnson's nights became a battleground of half-remembered horrors. She would jolt awake at 3 in the morning, sheets damp with sweat, the phantom laughter of children still ringing in her ears. The nightmares followed a pattern, shadowy trails winding through Discovery Park, small footprints in mud, and always the sound of boys calling out names she couldn't quite catch. "I'm remembering something," she whispered to her empty bedroom, the first grey light of dawn filtering through her curtains. "Something I buried long ago." Each morning brought fragments floating to the surface of her consciousness. Two small boys with matching caps, her mother's face twisted with worry, hushed conversations behind closed doors. The 71-year-old widow found herself sketching these images in her journal, trying to piece together the puzzle of her own childhood memories. I must have known them, she realized one morning, staring at her own childish drawing of two stick figures holding hands with a little girl. The rusty button she'd discovered seemed to have unlocked something within her, memories she had either forgotten or deliberately pushed away. Driven by an increasing sense of urgency, Mary began revisiting Discovery Park daily, ignoring the January chill that bit through her layers. She walked the familiar paths with new purpose, her photographer's eye scanning for landmarks that might trigger recognition. The elderly woman found herself drawn to a particular grove of ancient cedars, their massive trunks unchanged by the decades that had passed. "I used to play here," she murmured, touching the rough bark. "We all did." The cold wind stung her cheeks as she ventured deeper into the park each day, retracing steps from 75 years ago. Near a small ravine, Mary suddenly stopped, her heart pounding. This place, this exact spot, featured prominently in her nightmares. The memories flooded back with brutal clarity. Her mother pulling her away from this area, saying it was dangerous, a policeman asking questions, adults speaking in hushed, worried tones. They were looking for those boys even then, she realized, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. At home, Mary found herself opening boxes of her mother's belongings she'd kept but never examined closely. Among old photographs and keepsakes, she discovered a newspaper clipping from 1947 with the headline, "Search Continues for Missing Brothers." The photo showed a search party combing through the very section of the park where she'd found the button. "What did you know, Mum?" she whispered, fingers trembling as she traced the yellowed paper. "What were you hiding from me all these years?" Robert Smith arranged the meeting at a quiet corner table in a small cafe near the waterfront. Mary Johnson arrived early, her hands fidgeting with her purse strap as she waited. The historian had been enthusiastic on the phone, telling her he'd found someone who might help make sense of the mysterious button. "Mary, this is Michael Davis," Robert said as they approached her table. "He's the genealogist I mentioned." Michael was younger than Mary had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with an earnest expression and a laptop bag slung over his shoulder. He extended his hand with a warm smile. "It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. Johnson. Your discovery might be the breakthrough this case has needed for decades." As they settled in with steaming cups of coffee, Michael explained his work. He hosted a podcast called Lost Histories that specialized in untangling forgotten family stories and cold cases. The disappearance of two young brothers in 1947 had fascinated him since childhood. "My grandmother used to tell me about them," he said, opening his laptop. "The whole city was searching. It was the biggest case Seattle had ever seen." Mary watched as the young man pulled up digital archives with practiced ease. His passion for the hunt reminded her of herself at a younger age, before life had worn her down, before loneliness had become her constant companion. "I've already started mapping potential family connections," Michael continued, turning the screen toward her. "These newspaper clippings mention several families who lived near Discovery Park during that time period." Together, they spent hours examining ancestral records, census data, and digitized newspaper articles. Robert occasionally offered historical context about Seattle's neighborhoods and the social dynamics of the post-war era. "We should reach out to some of these elders," Michael suggested, pointing to a list of names. "People who were children then might remember details that never made it into official reports." Mary nodded, feeling a strange mixture of dread and hope. "I've been having memories," she admitted quietly. "Things I haven't thought about in decades." The genealogist's eyes met hers with understanding. "That happens sometimes when we disturb the past. Our minds start making connections we've buried." By evening, they had compiled a network of faded connections, families who had moved away suddenly, witnesses whose testimonies contradicted official accounts, and rumors of a cover-up involving prominent Seattle families. "There's something here," Robert murmured, studying their notes, "something people wanted forgotten." As they prepared to leave, Michael touched Mary's arm gently. "Whatever we find, Mrs. Johnson, it might be difficult to face." "Are you sure you want to continue?" Mary thought of the tiny button, of the children lost to time, and of her own buried memories struggling to surface. "I'm sure," she said firmly. "Some truths need to be uncovered, no matter how dark." Detective Sarah Brown stood before the dusty evidence boxes, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled on latex gloves. The cold case unit at the Seattle Police Department rarely reopened files as old as the Boys in the Woods case. But the discovery of that button had changed everything. Sarah tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, feeling the weight of her father's legacy pressing down on her shoulders. "My dad spent 20 years of his career obsessed with finding those brothers," she explained to Mary Johnson as they entered the archives together. "He passed away, still believing they could be found." The elderly photographer nodded silently, her camera hanging unused around her neck. The archives smelled of paper and time, a scent that seemed to whisper of secrets long kept. Detective Brown carefully lifted the lid off the first box, revealing manila folders yellowed with age. "These haven't been touched in decades," Sarah murmured, spreading the contents across a large metal table. Winter sunlight streamed through high windows, illuminating dancing dust motes that swirled above the evidence. Brittle reports crackled beneath her fingers as she arranged them chronologically. Mary leaned forward, her eyes scanning the documents with unexpected intensity. Photographs spilled from an envelope, grainy black and white images of Discovery Park from the late 40s, search parties combing through underbrush, and tearful parents clutching small jackets. The initial investigation was thorough, Sarah explained. But technology was limited then. What we can do with DNA and forensics now might finally bring closure. The detective's phone buzzed with a message from Robert Smith, who was coordinating with Michael Davis to compile a timeline of historical records. Sarah glanced at it briefly before returning to the evidence. "My father always said this case would break if someone looked at it with fresh eyes," she said, sorting through witness statements. "I never thought I'd be the one to—" "Wait." Mary's voice cut through the quiet room, her hand trembling as she pointed to a photograph partially hidden beneath others. That's me." Sarah carefully extracted the image, a blurry snapshot of a young girl, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, standing at the edge of the park. On either side of her were 2 small boys, their faces partially obscured, but their hands firmly clasped in hers. "Are you certain?" the detective asked, studying Mary's pale face. The widow nodded, her fingers hovering just above the photograph, as if afraid to touch it. "I don't remember this being taken. I don't remember these boys at all." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "But that's definitely me. And that coat, it was my favorite. My mother made it." Sarah carefully placed the photograph in an evidence bag, her mind racing with implications. If Mary had known the missing brothers, everything about the case would need to be reconsidered. "We need to talk about your childhood," she said gently, "and why you might have forgotten something this important." That night, nature unleashed its fury on Seattle. Rain lashed against windows while howling winds bent trees to breaking point. Mary Johnson sat alone in her living room, the button she'd discovered clutched in her trembling hand, as lightning illuminated the darkened sky in violent flashes. By dawn, Discovery Park resembled a battlefield. Park maintenance crews arrived early to clear fallen branches and assess the damage. Ted Ramirez, the lead groundskeeper, radioed for immediate police assistance when his team uncovered something horrifying near the site where Mary had found the button just days earlier. "The storm did what 75 years couldn't," Detective Sarah Brown explained to Mary over the phone, her voice tight with emotion. "A massive cedar came down and exposed a depression in the earth. We need you to come." When Mary arrived, the park had transformed into a crime scene. Yellow tape cordoned off a section of muddy ground where forensic technicians worked methodically. Sarah guided the elderly woman to a tent where Robert Smith was already waiting, his historian's eyes wide with the gravity of discovery. "They found them," he whispered. The brothers." In the freshly exposed earth lay 2 small skeletons, their fragile bones preserved by the soil's composition. They were positioned side by side, curled toward each other, as if seeking warmth or comfort in their final moments. One skeleton's arm extended across the other in what appeared to be a protective embrace. "They were just children," Mary murmured, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Babies, really." Michael Davis arrived shortly after, recording equipment in hand, but respectfully kept at his side. The young podcaster's face paled at the sight. "I never thought we'd actually find them," he admitted, standing beside Mary. "This changes everything." For the city, the discovery became instant headline news. Reporters gathered at the park entrance, broadcasting live updates as word spread. Social media exploded with theories and expressions of collective grief for children lost generations ago. But for Mary, the revelation brought no satisfaction, only a deepening dread. As she watched the medical examiner carefully document the remains, fragments of childhood memories surfaced. Her mother's hushed conversations, unexplained tears, and strange warnings to avoid certain parts of the park. I think my family knew something, she confessed to Sarah later that evening, her voice barely audible. The way my mother would change the subject whenever the missing boys were mentioned. The way she'd grip my hand tighter when we walked near this part of the park. The detective nodded grimly. We'll need to look into everyone connected to this area during that time period. Even your family, Mary. The widow closed her eyes, the terrible weight of possibility settling over her like a shroud. I know, she whispered. I know. While the forensic teams worked methodically at Discovery Park, Michael Davis hunched over his laptop in his apartment, following a digital trail that few would have the patience to unravel. Genealogy was more than a hobby for him. It was about restoring lost connections, giving names back to the forgotten. After weeks of cross-referencing DNA databases with historical records, his persistence paid off with a distant match. Linda Martinez, a 76-year-old woman living in a modest home in Spokane. The first phone call was difficult. Linda's voice trembled with suspicion and fear when Michael explained why he was contacting her. I don't talk about family matters with strangers, she said, her words clipped and defensive, but something in Michael's gentle persistence wore down her resistance. My mother would cry herself to sleep sometimes, Linda finally admitted during their third conversation. She'd mentioned the uncles she never knew, just little boys when they vanished. The family never spoke of them directly, like they were ghosts we weren't supposed to name. Michael shared this development with Mary Johnson that evening. The elderly photographer listened intently, her weathered hands clasping and unclasping as she absorbed each detail. We need to meet her, Mary insisted. Some stories can only be told face to face. The drive to Spokane took nearly 5 hours. Michael and Mary spoke little, each lost in thought as the Washington landscape rolled past their windows. Linda was waiting on her porch when they arrived, a small woman with sharp eyes that seemed to evaluate their every movement. I wasn't sure I'd let you in, she confessed, as she led them through a house filled with family photographs. But last night I dreamed of my mother, and she was telling me it was time. Linda disappeared into a back room and returned carrying a battered brown suitcase. My mother kept these hidden her whole life, never showed them to my father, said they were too painful to look at, but too precious to throw away. Inside the suitcase lay the fragments of lives cut short. Yellowed letters describing 2 spirited boys, black and white photographs of solemn children in Sunday clothes, newspaper clippings about the search. But it was a small metal object that made Mary gasp, a child's bracelet, tarnished by time but still intact, with the initials D. Carefully engraved on its surface. Daniel Donovan, Linda whispered, touching the bracelet reverently. My mother's uncle. He was wearing this when he disappeared with his brother Thomas. At least, that's what she always believed. Michael carefully photographed each item while Mary held the bracelet, feeling its weight, both physical and historical, in her palm. This small circle of metal would become the key that unlocked the brothers' identities, connecting them to a family that had mourned for generations. Mary Johnson couldn't explain what drew her to the attic that afternoon. Perhaps it was the weight of discovery pressing on her conscience, or simply the need to connect with something familiar as her world tilted on its axis. The narrow staircase creaked beneath her feet as she ascended, each step bringing her closer to a past she'd never fully examined. The attic was a museum of forgotten moments, illuminated by thin shafts of winter light filtering through a small window. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, their edges softened by decades of dust. Mary's fingers trembled slightly as she opened the first container, marked simply Mother's Things, in her own handwriting from years before. Inside lay the artifacts of her mother's life: photo albums with yellowed pages, costume jewelry that had lost its luster, and bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon. As she sifted through these remnants, a cream-colored envelope slipped from between two books, landing softly on her lap. The paper felt delicate, almost alive beneath her fingertips. "My dearest daughter," the letter began in her mother's elegant script. Mary's breath caught as she read on. "There are burdens we carry that should never be yours. The boys left behind in the woods haunt me still. This terrible secret we must never tell will die with me." As it should. The elderly woman sat back against a trunk, the letter clutched to her chest. All these years, her mother had known something about the disappearance. The realization crashed over her like an icy wave. Had her mother merely heard rumors? Or was she somehow involved? The possibilities made Mary's stomach twist with dread. She remembered her mother's strange behavior whenever news reports mentioned missing children, how she would abruptly change the channel or leave the room. At the time, Mary had attributed it to general sensitivity. Now, those moments took on a sinister new meaning. "What did you know?" she whispered to the empty attic, her voice catching on unshed tears. The guilt that had shadowed Mary since finding the button now threatened to crush her entirely. If her mother had known something, had kept silent all these years, what did that make Mary herself? An unwitting accomplice to decades of silence and pain. She gathered the letter and several photo albums, determined to search for clues she might have missed. As she descended the stairs, the weight of her discovery settled across her shoulders like a physical burden. The truth was emerging from its long hibernation, and Mary realized with terrible clarity that she might not be prepared for what it would reveal about her family, or herself. Michael Davis stared at his laptop screen in disbelief. The genealogy database had returned a match he never expected. His own grandfather, John Davis, appeared in employment records from the 1940s. According to the yellow document, John had worked as a custodian at Evergreen Children's Home, a facility that once stood less than a mile from Discovery Park. "This can't be coincidence," Michael whispered, his fingers trembling slightly as he dialed Mary's number. The young podcaster had grown increasingly invested in the case, but this personal connection sent a chill down his spine. When Mary answered, Michael shared his discovery, his voice tight with emotion. "My grandfather never talked about that job. Not once in all the stories he told me growing up." Mary listened carefully, her mind racing with possibilities. "Perhaps he had reasons to forget," she replied softly. That evening, Michael visited his Aunt Clara, his grandfather's only surviving child. The elderly woman sat in her rocking chair, eyes clouding with memory, as Michael broached the subject. "Dad wouldn't speak of that place," Clara admitted, her weathered hands fidgeting with her cardigan. "But sometimes, after a few drinks at Christmas, he'd mutter about those poor lost boys who haunted the hallways. We all thought it was just old man's ramblings." Meanwhile, Mary felt drawn to explore her basement, a space she rarely visited since her husband's passing. Cardboard boxes and forgotten furniture gathered dust in the dim light. In the corner stood an antique radio cabinet, its wood dulled by decades of neglect. Something compelled her to examine it closer. When Mary removed the back panel, she discovered a small reel-to-reel tape hidden in a secret compartment. Her heart pounded as she realized what she held. Her mother had been known to record conversations she deemed important. The next day, Robert Smith helped Mary play the degraded tape on equipment borrowed from the Historical Society. Through the static and hiss, two women's voices emerged, one unmistakably her mother's, the other unknown. "They're asking questions again about the boys in the woods," her mother whispered urgently. "You promised never to speak of it," the other woman hissed. "Think of your daughter. Think of the families involved. But those children deserve—" "Silence. Some secrets must stay buried, Margaret, for everyone's sake." Mary's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Her mother had known something all along. When she called Michael to share her discovery, his voice was equally strained. "My aunt gave me my grandfather's journal," he said. "There's an entry from 1947. It just says, 'God forgive us all for what happened to those brothers.'" The truth, long buried beneath decades of silence, was finally clawing its way to the surface. Detective Sarah Brown slammed her office door shut, the sound reverberating through the precinct's cold case unit. Another frustrating meeting with her superiors had left her seething. The department chief had suggested, not for the first time, that perhaps the Boys in the Woods case should be handled discreetly and with appropriate sensitivity to all parties involved. Sarah knew what that meant. Several prominent Seattle families had connections to the children's home where the brothers had stayed before their disappearance. These families now held positions of power throughout the city, on the council, in business circles. Even within the police department itself, anonymous calls had been coming in, suggesting the detective might want to focus on more pressing matters or cases with actual leads. "They've been silencing this for 75 years, she muttered, spreading the case files across her desk. The detective stared at the photographs of the button Mary Johnson had discovered, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. Her father had been a rookie officer when the original investigation was quietly shelved. He'd never forgotten it, mentioning the lost boys, even on his deathbed. "I promised him I'd find the truth," Sarah whispered to the empty room. Her phone buzzed with a text from Michael Davis. The young genealogist had uncovered another potential witness, an elderly groundskeeper who had worked near Discovery Park in the late 40s. Every lead mattered, no matter how small. Sarah worked late into the night, the office lights casting long shadows as she meticulously connected threads between witness statements, timelines, and the physical evidence. The department had reluctantly assigned a forensic anthropologist to examine the button and fabric, but Sarah suspected the results would mysteriously disappear if she didn't maintain constant vigilance. When her desk phone rang at 11:30, she answered with trepidation. "You should drop this," a muffled voice warned. "Some stories are better left buried." The detective's hand tightened around the receiver. "Not this one," she replied firmly before hanging up. The next morning, Sarah found her case files had been accidentally moved to the archive basement. Her parking space was reassigned to a visiting federal agent. Small, petty attempts at discouragement that only strengthened her resolve. At lunch, Mary Johnson arrived with homemade sandwiches, her elderly face lined with concern. "Are you all right? Michael told me about the pressure you're facing." "I'm fine," Sarah assured her, though exhaustion shadowed her eyes. "Those boys deserve justice. You deserve answers." Mary nodded, her weathered hands trembling slightly. "My mother took secrets to her grave. I won't do the same." The detective smiled, drawing strength from the elderly woman's quiet determination and Michael's unwavering support. Together, they formed an unlikely alliance against decades of carefully constructed silence. "We'll find the truth," Sarah promised, "no matter who tries to stop us." The Emerald Cafe hummed with the gentle murmur of conversation as 6 elderly residents gathered around a corner table. Mary Johnson had arranged this meeting, hoping their collective memories might fill the gaps in her understanding. Steam rose from porcelain cups as they reminisced about Discovery Park in their youth, when it was simply the woods where neighborhood children played. "We never went too deep," said Eleanor Wilson, her arthritic fingers wrapped around her mug. "Parents were strict about boundaries after those boys vanished." Henry Blackwell, 93 and sharp as ever, leaned forward. "I remember seeing them. You know, the day before they disappeared." The table fell silent as he continued. "They weren't alone. They were with Councilman Davis. Michael Davis flinched at the mention of his family name, exchanging a quick glance with Mary. "My father mentioned that connection once," Michael admitted quietly, "but he said it was just rumors." Margaret Chen, who had lived on the same street as Mary's family, shook her head. "It wasn't rumors. Your grandfather worked at that children's home, and the councilman visited regularly. Everyone knew, but nobody spoke about it." "The war had just ended," Henry added. "People wanted to believe in heroes, not monsters." Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. "Your mother, Mary, she knew something. I remember her pulling me aside at church one Sunday. Her eyes were red from crying." The elderly woman's voice trembled. "She begged me not to ask questions about those poor boys, said some things were better left buried." The weight of decades-old secrets settled over the table. Outside, rain began to tap against the windows, mirroring tears that formed in Mary's eyes. "There were whispers about improper care at that home," Eleanor said. "Children who weren't wanted, who had no one to speak for them." "The councilman had powerful friends," Henry muttered. "When those boys disappeared—" The investigation barely lasted a week. Mary felt her chest tighten. "And no one said anything for 75 years. The cafe grew quiet as the elderly residents exchanged glances heavy with shame. "We were children ourselves," Margaret finally said. "By the time we were old enough to understand, it seemed too late. The story was buried, just like those boys." Michael placed a gentle hand on Mary's shoulder as she struggled to process this new information. The photographer's suspicions about her mother's involvement deepened, each revelation bringing her closer to a truth she both craved and feared. "There's one more thing," Henry said, sliding a yellowed newspaper clipping across the table. "The last photo of the councilman with the boys. Look at who's standing in the background." Mary's hand trembled as she recognized her mother's youthful face, eyes wide with what she now recognized as terror. Michael Davis hunched over his laptop in the dimly lit corner of the Seattle Public Library, his fingers tapping furiously against the keyboard. For days, he'd been tracking down a school attendance record from 1947 that might confirm the brothers' identities. The city archivist had assured him it was catalogued, but when Michael finally gained access to the archives, the crucial volume was nowhere to be found. "That's impossible," he muttered. Drawing irritated glances from nearby patrons, the young genealogist had encountered missing records before, but this was different. The logbook had been properly documented in the system just 3 years ago during a digitization project. Someone had deliberately removed it, someone who understood exactly what it contained. He called Detective Sarah Brown immediately. "The record's gone," he explained, keeping his voice low and not misplaced. "The checkout log shows it was last requested by someone using Councilman Wilson's credentials. Paul Wilson's father," Sarah replied, the connection immediately clear. "The family's been in city politics for generations." Meanwhile, across town, Mary Johnson sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, surrounded by cardboard boxes she'd dragged from the attic. Each contained fragments of her mother's life, photographs, letters, and trinkets saved over decades. Her arthritic fingers trembled as she opened a small, leather-bound book tucked beneath a stack of yellowed greeting cards. Her mother's childhood diary. The pages crackled as Mary carefully turned them, the faded blue ink barely legible in places. Most entries were mundane, school activities, neighborhood gossip, the typical musings of a 12-year-old girl in 1945. But as Mary reached entries from early 1947, the tone changed dramatically. "Our mama says we mustn't talk about the boys who left and never returned," one entry read. "She says bad things happen to people who ask questions." Mary's breath caught. Another entry, dated 2 weeks later. "Saw Mr. D burying something in the park today. He looked scared when he noticed me watching. Mamma says I must forget what I saw. Cold dread settled in Mary's stomach. Her mother had known something, had perhaps witnessed something, but had chosen silence. A silence she'd passed down to her daughter like a poisoned inheritance. Mary reached for her phone with shaking hands and dialed Michael's number. "I found something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My mother knew about those boys. She saw something in the park when she was just a child herself." "I'm coming over," Michael replied without hesitation. "And Mary, don't tell anyone else what you've found. Not yet." As she hung up, Mary stared at the diary in her lap, the weight of generations of silence pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Linda Martinez sat across from Mary in the small cafe near Discovery Park, her weathered hands wrapped around a ceramic mug. The elderly woman's eyes, clouded with decades of unspoken grief, finally met Mary's. "My mother would break down completely whenever the news reported missing children," Linda confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "She'd lock herself in her bedroom for hours. As a child, I never understood why." Mary Johnson reached across the table, gently touching Linda's trembling fingers. The connection between them, forged through shared pain and secrets, felt both fragile and unbreakable. "She knew, didn't she?" Mary asked softly. Linda nodded, tears streaming down her lined face. The family whispered about it, the uncles who vanished, but fear silenced everyone. "My grandfather threatened terrible consequences if anyone spoke of it outside our home." "What were they afraid of?" Mary pressed, though she suspected the answer. "Powerful people were involved," Linda replied. "People with influence, with money. My mother believed they'd destroy what little our family had left if we pursued the truth." The weight of generational guilt hung heavy in the air between them. Linda pulled a faded photograph from her purse, two small boys standing beside a tall oak tree, their smiles frozen in time. "These were them," she said, "David and Daniel. My mother kept this hidden until the day she died." Michael Davis, who had been quietly recording their conversation with Linda's permission, felt his throat tighten with emotion. The genealogist had traced countless family histories, but none had affected him so deeply. That evening, Michael worked through the night, carefully crafting the podcast episode that would change everything. He wove together Linda's testimony, historical records, and Mary's discovery into a narrative that honored the lost brothers while exposing the decades of institutional silence. When Bud the Button in the Woods episode went live 3 days later, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, it had been downloaded 50,000 times. By the end of the week, national news networks were running segments on the case. "I never expected this," Mary told Michael, as they watched coverage of protests forming outside Seattle's City Hall. Hundreds of citizens demanded accountability, carrying signs with the brothers, names and photos. "People recognize injustice when they see it," Michael replied, scrolling through messages from listeners around the country offering support and information. "Some secrets can't stay buried forever." For Linda, watching from her quiet home in Spokane, the public outcry brought both vindication and relief. After 75 years of silence, someone was finally listening. The truth her family had feared to speak was now being shouted from the streets. The news coverage of the discovery had spread across Seattle like wildfire. Mary Johnson sat in her living room, hands wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold, when the phone rang. The unfamiliar voice on the other end belonged to Paul Wilson, a retired city clerk who had seen her interview on the evening broadcast. "I've been carrying this burden for over 50 years, Paul explained, his voice cracking with age and emotion. "When I saw your face on television, I knew it was time." They arranged to meet at the cafe near Discovery Park the following morning. Mary arrived early, anxiety knotting her stomach as she watched the door. When Paul finally entered, a thin man with stooped shoulders and rheumy eyes, she recognized the look of someone haunted by the past. "I did something unforgivable," the former clerk confessed after settling into the booth. "In 1963, I removed documents about those boys from city records, official reports, witness statements, all of it." Mary's heart hammered against her ribs. "Why would you do that?" Paul's weathered hands trembled as he explained how his mentor, Thomas Green, had been the park's commissioner in the 40s. Green had taken a special interest in troubled children, often bringing them to Discovery Park for fresh air and moral instruction. "Thomas was like a father to me," Paul whispered. "When investigators started looking into old cases in the 60s, I found his name connected to those missing brothers. I couldn't bear to see him ruined." Even posthumously. The elderly man reached into his worn leather briefcase and withdrew a sealed manila envelope, yellowed with age. "Everything I took is here, including Thomas's private confession. He wrote it before his death, too ashamed to come forward, but too burdened to take the secret to his grave." Mary stared at the envelope, suddenly afraid of what it contained. Her fingers brushed against the paper, feeling the weight of 75 years of silence. "The brothers were in his care that day," Paul continued, tears welling in his eyes. "There was an accident, or at least that's what he claimed. But the details—" He shook his head. "Seattle was building its reputation as a progressive city. A scandal involving a prominent official and 2 dead children would have destroyed that image." Mary took the envelope, understanding that its contents would change everything, not just for her, but for the city that had buried this truth for generations. "I should have done this decades ago," Paul said, rising slowly from his seat. "Maybe then I could have slept at night." As he shuffled toward the door, Mary called after him, "Paul, thank you for your courage." The old man paused, shoulders hunched under an invisible weight. "Don't thank me. Just make sure those boys aren't forgotten again." The laboratory results arrived on a Tuesday morning. Detective Sarah Brown spread the forensic report across her desk, her face growing pale as she absorbed the findings. The toxicology tests had revealed a devastating truth. The brothers hadn't died from physical trauma or exposure as initially suspected, but from a lethal dose of plant-based toxins commonly found in certain wild berries and mushrooms. "They were poisoned," Sarah explained to Mary Johnson and Michael Davis, who sat across from her in the precinct's small conference room. "The toxin concentration suggests deliberate administration, not accidental ingestion." Michael leaned forward, his recorder capturing every word. "Someone fed them poisonous plants." "The forensic botanist believes it was likely mixed into food or drink," Sarah continued, her voice steady despite the horror of what she was describing. "That the concentration was high enough to cause rapid sedation followed by respiratory failure. They would have appeared to fall asleep before—" Mary clutched her handbag tighter, imagining 2 small boys accepting food from someone they trusted, perhaps even feeling drowsy and confused as the poison took effect. The thought of them lying down in the forest, never to wake again, sent a wave of nausea through her body. "They were trying to cover something up," Sarah said, tapping a finger on another document. "Based on the timeline we've reconstructed, the brothers were likely witnesses to something they shouldn't have seen. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was calculated." Mary's thoughts drifted to her mother's cryptic warnings and hushed conversations. Had she known? Had she suspected? The elderly woman pictured her mother's face, always tense when the park was mentioned, always changing the subject when certain names came up in conversation. "My mother knew something," Mary whispered, more to herself than the others. "All those years of silence. Was she protecting someone? Or was she simply too afraid to speak?" Michael placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We don't know yet, Mary, but we're getting closer." The detective nodded in agreement. "The toxin profile gives us a new avenue to investigate. Not many people in 1947 would have known which plants could cause a death that mimicked natural causes." As they left the police station, Mary paused to watch children playing in a nearby park. Their laughter carried on the wind, innocent and free. She thought of the brothers, final moments, confused, frightened, abandoned among the trees. Had they called out for help? Had they understood what was happening? The question of her mother's complicity would haunt Mary for the rest of her life, a shadow that would never fully lift, even if they discovered the complete truth. Was her silence born of terror, shame, or misguided loyalty? Mary feared she might never know. Detective Sarah Brown stood before the Seattle City Council, her posture rigid with determination. The evidence folders lay spread across the polished table, photographs of the skeletal remains, DNA results, and the damning confession from the sealed envelope Paul Wilson had provided. "These boys deserve justice," Sarah declared, her voice unwavering despite the hostile stares from several council members. 75 years is too long for the truth to remain buried. The council chamber erupted in heated debate. Several officials, descendants of Seattle's oldest families, argued that reopening wounds from the past served no purpose. Others, visibly uncomfortable, suggested a quiet settlement and private memorial would be more appropriate. Sarah refused to back down. Within days, the repercussions began. Her supervisor reassigned her to desk duty, citing resource allocation. Anonymous calls flooded her phone at all hours. Someone even keyed her car in the police department parking lot, scratching "Leave it alone" across the driver's door. "They're scared," Michael Davis told her over coffee at their regular cafe near Discovery Park. "You've touched a nerve that connects to powerful people." The young genealogist had been working tirelessly, helping Sarah navigate the political minefield while continuing his research. His podcast episodes about the case had garnered hundreds of thousands of downloads, bringing national attention to Seattle's darkest secret. Meanwhile, Mary Johnson found her own way to honor the lost brothers. Using her amateur photography skills, she captured a simple, heartbreaking image. Two tiny, weathered shoes she'd purchased from an antique store, placed gently on a bed of emerald moss beneath the towering cedars where the boys had been found. "I needed to give them something beautiful," Mary explained when Sarah visited her home. "Something to show they weren't forgotten." The elderly woman posted the photograph online with a brief account of the case. By morning, it had been shared over 50,000 times. News outlets picked up the story, and within a week, Mary's quiet tribute had transformed into a movement. People from across the country began leaving pairs of children's shoes at the park entrance. Letters arrived from families of other missing children, thanking Mary for giving voice to their pain. The brothers, now identified through DNA as Daniel and David Donovan, became symbols of all children lost to time and silence. Sarah found herself at the center of a storm. Professionally isolated, but publicly supported. When the mayor attempted to shut down the impromptu memorial, the backlash was immediate and fierce. "They can threaten my job," Sarah told Mary and Michael as they stood among the growing collection of shoes and flowers. "But they can't bury the truth again, not this time." As spring breathed new life into Discovery Park, the ancient cedars stood tall, their branches adorned with fresh green buds. Mary Johnson and Michael Davis spent weeks planning a memorial service for the two brothers who had lain forgotten beneath the forest floor for 75 years. They chose a clearing near where the button had been found, a place now transformed by the changing seasons, yet forever marked by tragedy. On a clear April morning, people began to gather. Detective Sarah Brown arrived early, helping to arrange simple wooden chairs in semicircles around two small stone markers. Robert Smith brought historical photographs mounted on boards, creating a timeline of the boys' short lives and the long shadow of their disappearance. Linda Martinez had traveled all the way from Spokane, clutching the child's bracelet engraved with D.D. that had become a symbol of the case. "I never thought I'd see this day," Linda whispered to Mary as they placed wildflowers around the markers. "My mother would have found peace knowing they weren't forgotten." The crowd grew larger than anyone had anticipated. Elderly residents who had carried whispers of the tragedy for decades stood alongside young families drawn by Michael's podcast. City officials, some reluctant, others genuinely moved, occupied the back rows. Paul Wilson, the retired clerk who had finally revealed the hidden documents, sat with head bowed, his shoulders lighter after decades of silence. Mary stepped forward to speak, her voice steady despite her age. These boys were not just a mystery to be solved or a tragedy to be mourned. They were children who deserved to be protected, remembered, and honored. She spoke of community responsibility, of the cost of silence, and of the healing power of truth. Sunlight filtered through the branches, casting dappled patterns across the gathered faces. Michael watched as Mary addressed the crowd, noticing how she stood taller now, unburdened by the secrets that had haunted her for so long. When she finished speaking, he joined her to read the brothers' real names aloud for the first time in a public forum. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees as the ceremony concluded. People lingered, sharing stories and forming new connections. Sarah introduced Mary to her young daughter, who placed a handmade paper boat beside each marker, a child's tribute to children long lost. For the first time since uncovering the button, Mary felt the weight of guilt begin to lift from her shoulders. The truth had been painful, but in facing it alongside others who sought justice, she had found something unexpected, a fragile but real sense of peace. As she watched the community disperse along the park trails, Mary knew that the brothers would never again be forgotten. Mary Johnson's phone rang incessantly for 3 days after the news broke about her mother's connection to the lost boys. Each time, it was another family member, cousins, nieces, a distant uncle, all with the same message. How could she drag their family name through the mud? How could she suggest her own mother had known about those poor children and said nothing? By the 4th day, the calls stopped entirely. The silence hurt more than the accusations. "They'll come around," Robert told her over coffee at the cafe near Discovery Park. But his eyes betrayed his uncertainty. Mary shook her head. "No, they won't, and perhaps they shouldn't." She watched a young family walk by outside the window. 2 children laughing as they chased each other. "My mother kept a terrible secret, and I exposed it. In their eyes, I'm the traitor." Her modest apartment felt cavernous now. The photographs of family gatherings that once lined her hallway had been taken down, not by angry relatives, but by Mary herself. She couldn't bear to see those smiling faces, knowing what lay beneath the surface of their shared history. One evening, as rain tapped against her windows, Mary sat at her kitchen table, sorting through the evidence that had accumulated over months of investigation. The child's bracelet with the initials D.D. caught the lamplight, a small, tangible connection to David Donovan, the older of the 2 brothers. Beside it lay the faded newspaper clippings, forensic reports, and Linda's family photographs. "Daniel and David Donovan," she whispered, running her finger over their names. Not just the boys in the woods anymore. Detective Sarah Brown had called earlier that day with news that the case was officially closed. The brothers' remains would be properly buried in Lakeview Cemetery next month. With headstones bearing their full names and dates, Mary felt a strange lightness despite her isolation. For 75 years, those children had lain forgotten beneath the forest floor, their identities erased, their story untold. Now they would be remembered properly. That night, she wrote in her journal, "The truth has cost me my family, but it has given 2 little boys back their names. It has given them dignity, and somehow, in giving them justice, I found a measure of peace for myself." Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away the last of winter. Mary Johnson was alone, but for the first time in decades, she felt unburdened, as if she too had finally been found after being lost for a very long time. Michael Davis found himself transformed by the journey into the past. What had begun as a professional interest in genealogy had become a personal mission. In the months following the memorial service, he launched a new podcast series called Buried Truths, dedicated to helping families uncover their own lost stories and historical mysteries. His gentle approach and genuine empathy drew listeners from across the country, many with their own buried secrets to share. "Each family has stories that deserve to be told," Michael explained during a community workshop at the Seattle Public Library. "Sometimes the truth hurts, but it also heals." His friendship with Mary Johnson deepened in unexpected ways. The 71-year-old widow, once so isolated in her grief and guilt, now found herself welcomed into Michael's circle of friends and collaborators. Their weekly coffee meetings at the cafe near Discovery Park became a fixture in both their lives. For Mary, these moments represented something she had nearly forgotten how to experience: trust. "You taught me that the past doesn't have to poison the present," Mary told him one rainy afternoon, her weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug. "I never thought I'd feel connected to anyone again." Detective Sarah Brown faced her own reckoning with the past. Though the case had cost her professionally, passed over for promotion, and subtly ostracized by colleagues who thought she'd rocked the boat too vigorously, she carried herself with quiet dignity. The knowledge that she had fulfilled her father's unspoken promise brought her a peace that transcended career setbacks. "My father used to say that some truths are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems hopeless," Sarah shared during a small ceremony honoring her work. "I finally understand what he meant." The city of Seattle, too, began its slow process of healing. The scandal had forced painful conversations about institutional responsibility, historical injustice, and the cost of collective silence. Local schools incorporated the brothers' story into their curriculum, teaching children about the importance of speaking up when something feels wrong. As spring blossomed across Discovery Park, the 3 unlikely allies, the elderly photographer, the young genealogist, and the determined detective, often walked the trails together, their shared experience creating bonds that defied age and circumstance. "Some wounds never fully heal," Michael observed, "but they can become part of who we are without defining us completely." Mary nodded, watching the sunlight filter through the trees where 2 small boys had once played. "That's the gift they gave us, isn't it? The chance to be whole again, even with our scars." Today, a simple stone memorial stands at the edge of Discovery Park, its inscription worn smooth by wind and rain. The polished granite bears the names of the 2 brothers, finally remembered properly after 75 years of anonymity. Visitors often pause here, leaving small tokens, pebbles, wildflowers, occasionally a child's button, as they reflect on the story that captivated the nation. Mary Johnson visits every Sunday, regardless of weather. The elderly photographer moves more slowly now, but her eyes remain sharp, taking in the changing seasons around the memorial she helped create. Sometimes Michael Davis accompanies her, the young genealogist having become something of a surrogate family member since her own relatives distanced themselves after the revelations. I never expected to find peace here. Mary tells a young family who recognizes her from the documentary, but there's something healing about facing the truth, no matter how painful. The case has transformed Seattle in subtle ways. Detective Sarah Brown received a commendation for her persistence, despite institutional resistance, and the police department established new protocols for handling cold cases involving children. The detective often credits her late father's determination as her guiding light through the investigation's darkest moments. Robert Smith, whose historical expertise first connected Mary to the authorities, has published a comprehensive account of the case. His book details how generations of silence nearly buried the truth forever, and how one woman's accidental discovery changed everything. Linda Martinez moved from Spokane to be closer to the memorial, finding unexpected solace in finally knowing what happened to her distant relatives. The elderly woman volunteers at the park's visitor center, gently sharing the brothers' story with those who ask. On the anniversary of the discovery, the five of them, Mary, Michael, Sarah, Robert, and Linda, gather at the cafe near the park. Their conversation flows easily now, unburdened by the secrets that once stood between them and the truth. "Sometimes I wonder if my mother would be proud or horrified," Mary says, warming her hands around her coffee cup, "but I've stopped carrying her guilt alongside my own." As the seasons change and the city grows, Mary knows that every story matters, even those buried beneath decades of leaves, silence, and sorrow. The memorial stands as testament to this belief, a reminder that no one should disappear without trace or remembrance. The truth, once unearthed, has indeed set a community free, one whispered secret at a time. And for Mary Johnson, the woman who stumbled upon a button and uncovered a mystery, there is finally peace in knowing that the brothers will never again be forgotten.